So, hello everybody. My name is Shulamit Rosinsky. I have just finished my MA at the Rice Livnat program, and I will present my thesis today. The Sound of Silence, the story of the deaf, the story of the Jewish deaf communities in the Holocaust, the story of the Jewish deaf communities in the Holocaust. First of all, I would like to say thank you to Dr. Miriam Ofer, who guided me through this project and supported me throughout my work. Today I will focus on Nazi attitude towards the deaf populations and results of my research on the Jewish deaf communities in Germany and Poland before the war. I will show specific unique aspects of deaf survivor testimonies that can teach us about the unique story of the deaf Holocaust. Lastly, I will propose future work on this subject. During the 19th century, big steps were made to improve education for deaf. Some Jews were at the heart of this development. In Paris, Jacob Rodriguez Ferreira was one of the first to succeed in teaching deaf children to speak. In London, the Jewish Deaf and the Dumb Institute was established during the 1860s and was one of the most successful schools for deaf in England and in the world. One of the first rules of the Nazis made was the law for prevention of offspring with hereditary disease. Chapter 7 of this law pretends specifically to hereditary deafness as one of the diseases that the nation needs to eliminate. Deafness can be caused by problem in any of the station of the sound transfer, from the outer ear to the hearing areas of the brain. When we look at newborns with deafness, up to 80% are due to genetic. By the end of childhood, this number is down to 50%. In 1979, Horst Wiesold, a German teacher of deaf children, heard the story of one deaf girl who underwent sterilization under the Nazi regime. Initially, he did not believe, since he had not heard of such stories. Sterilization was a cause for shame and was hidden. Only very few out of the deaf community had knowledge of it, and only after discussing with the deaf community pastor was he finally convinced. Wiesold researched the subject, reading archives materials from schools and institutions for the deaf. Finally, he interviewed over 1,200 deaf people who agreed to tell their stories. In his book, Wiesold presents the Nazi ideology towards the deaf, the collaborations of teachers and institutions with sterilization project, and even the collaboration of certain deaf people with the Nazi and the sterilization. His research was a turning point. Following publication of his research, the deaf who had undergone sterilization were finally recognized as victims of the Nazis. Just recently, some received compensation from the German government. The subject of deaf people in the Holocaust has become recognized, including publication and conferences. Here's a short video of a testimony of a German who underwent sterilization.
They explained to the deaf children that they didn't want deaf children, that they had to be sterilized because they didn't want deaf children to have children who would grow up and be deaf as well. We were young, we really didn't understand. The man that came from the government to our school told the teacher to choose which children that we should send to the hospital for sterilization. Then as the time became near, I was in the kitchen and I was cleaning. My mother came and said, "Helga, sit down." And she explained, "You have to go to the hospital in 2 days." My father cried. He refused to see me. He didn't want to hug me before I left home to go to the hospital. Not until later, years later, I saw my baby sister. She had a beautiful baby. The baby was so beautiful, and I got to hold the baby, and that morning my sister was feeding the baby, and then I realized what I felt when I realized I couldn't have any children. I started to cry, and I ran into the bathroom and just cried and cried. When I came back out, my sister said, "What's wrong? What's the matter?" I said, "Oh, I'm just crying because I'm happy for you because you have a beautiful child."
It is important to realize that even though many deaf people underwent sterilization, many other non-hereditary deaf people were not affected by the law. Many deaf identified with the Nazi ideology, and even deaf people, due to genetic causes, after being sterilized, continued living as a normal citizen. The Nazi united deaf societies under one organization, the Regede, headed by the Nazi Party member Fritz Elbers. Here we see him in a Nazi uniform. In the Hitlerjugend, there were also groups for deaf children, and even the German military had deaf units. Here we can see a newspaper clipping reporting on an entire unit of deaf given one of the most dangerous tasks of guarding the French front, since they believed they would be less scared of the noises of the bombs. At the end, they surrendered to the French, interestingly, in sign language. At the end, out of about 45,000 deaf Germans, about 15,000 underwent sterilization. In Germany, there was a community of about 1,000 Jewish deaf. The community was organized very well due to one important person. In 1873, a young teacher named Markus Reich established a school for Jewish deaf children in Berlin, in a suburb called Vicenze. Reich studied education in the Academy for Jewish Teachers in Berlin, and following that, he worked at the Royal Institution for Deaf in Berlin. At this school, he studied the oral method for deaf education. Following the establishment of the school, the deaf community started to form around the school. In order to support the school, and throughout the years, different charities and cultural groups also were established. Thanks to this organization, the community grew and became stronger. From a point where the deaf were neglected and not educated, they became successful at different jobs, including even business and science. Children were sent to that school from all over Germany and Europe, and even from Palestine. We can see here a synagogue for deaf, in which the Chazan and the one reading the Torah are facing to the crowd, and not facing east as was common. This so the community can read their lips and be part of their service. Another Jew that was educated as a teacher for the deaf in Vienna was Yitzhak Yaakov Bredrich. Bredrich established a school for the deaf in Lemberg. This school was actually established prior to the one in Berlin, but did not develop and grew as well as the Berlin school. In Lemberg, there were about 20 children, mostly poor children from Lemberg and around Galicia. The institution was supported by the government as well as the local Jewish community. A branch was also established in Bujanov, a small town between Lemberg and Krakow. In Poland, there were a number of small schools for the small amount of local deaf Jewish children, but none of these grew as the fame and succeed as the Berlin school. It is important to discuss the Polish Jewish deaf community since it was the largest in the world, about 4,000 deaf Jews. The 20th century saw a growth in the number of Jewish organizations around Poland. Zionist, communist, and youth groups. At the same time, also the deaf Jewish community started establishing organizations and institutions. The Jewish deaf community present an interesting case where all the local communities around Poland were able to unite under one central association. Not only were they able to unite nationally, but they started forming ties and bonds with other organizations around Europe, and even were able to organize 2 conferences, one in Prague and one in Warsaw. Here we can see a document with the logo of the organization, the document. Some of the deaf activists were sent to Palestine, perhaps to check out the option of making Aliyah, since immigration problems were one of the subjects that discussed in the papers of the organization. In 1935, Oskar Wasserman, the head of the Polish organization, visited Palestine. He helped the local Jewish community from an association and establish a local community. This organization will then serve as the foundation for the Deaf Association that exists till this day. Let us touch for a couple of minutes on the subject of testimonies of deaf survivors. For my thesis, I listened, watched, and read several hours of testimonies by the deaf. Altogether, I based my thesis on about 30 testimonies. When dealing with testimonies of deaf, there are a few challenges. First, we need an interpretation from sign language to a spoken language, and that sometimes from one spoken language to another. This can create a confusion and sometimes mistakes. Second, an interviewer that is not from the deaf community does not know the culture or the history of the community, and this can further create a gap, both in empathy and in communication. People in the deaf community may sometimes shy from discussion with hearing people, and these are some of the challenges. Let us listen to 2 testimonies. The first is Miriam Rubin. Here we can see a witness of problematic communication. Both the interpreter and the interviewer do not understand what Miriam is saying, and this causes frustration on all sides. Miriam is talking about the school she learned in her childhood. She was born in Jerusalem, and at the age of 6 was sent to Vienna to relatives, where she went to the local Jewish school for deaf. For several minutes, the interpreter and the interviewer are sure she's talking about the school for deaf in Jerusalem, which didn't even have a school for deaf. Knowledge of the history of the Israeli community and the deaf education at that time could have helped prevent this. So I'll be happy to.
Yeah, no for deaf children. Interesting. And did she have friends? Did she have friends? I didn't from Poland. But everyone was from Poland, from Hungary, they were all from all different places. Well, technically from Poland. Most of them were from Poland. Were they all Jewish children? All of them. Yeah, it was a Jewish school. Yeah, what do you remember about me? The deaf in Austria. Okay, but in first school she went to school in Jerusalem. I did, but the deaf, yes. And what did she remember her mother telling her about why they were sending her that's why I had to go to school. And I had to learn how to speak and write. That's why I was going to school for the deaf. At that time, Jerusalem didn't have a school for the deaf. So my mother sent me to school in Austria for the deaf. Israel going to Jerusalem going to okay. So put back and gather a good threat. And there are 4 or 5 deaths from Israel. Going with me at the same time. Some are older, some are younger. So the school that you were talking about that was kosher was in Austria, not yeah, right. Okay, I think
The second testimony shows us the challenges of the deaf in the camps. I will not expand on all the okay, I want to show it to you first.
It was frightening. It was a bad idea to be in the front. I was always in the back last. There were rows of 5, lines upon lines. Men and women were in different formations. There were no children at all, none. People would tug at me, so I knew when my name was called. Different women would help me when my mother happened to be out somewhere else. They all knew, and I stayed quiet.
I will not expand on all the finding from the testimonies, but in general we can see physical distance. Sorry, 1 second. Physical distance from their families. They were often sent away for school at a very young age and weren't with their families when the war broke out. The physical distance also created an emotional distance, which was also affected by the language difficulties and culture differences, even with their families. As we saw in the second testimony, the survivors often discussed the difficulty in understanding what was happening around them, which increased the confusion which everybody was experiencing. Deafness also increased their dependence on families and friends. On the other hand, some stories present certain positive aspects. One of the most impressive stories of survival is the story of Moshe Falkovich, who was helped by the network of deaf non-Jews in order to survive. Among these was Yugana Shluja, who received a Chassid Umot HaOlam for this. And I have the honor to Yosef Komem. His father is Moshe.
I was saved by his family.
After the war, the story of the deaf did not receive enough attention, and no extensive studies or research were conducted. Even now, most of the literature and studies on deaf are on the non-Jewish deaf sterilization in Germany. One of the aspects I'm interested in researching is the effect on the second generation for deaf parents. These children are often responsible for being the bridge to the hearing world. One lady I was listening to her, emphasized how during the Eichmann trial, her deaf mother was desperate for her communication, putting a lot of stress on her as a young girl. There are a number of monuments, such as this one in Amsterdam, as you see. On the left, we can see a picture by David Bloch. David, a deaf Jewish artist who escaped Germany in 1939, and many years after the war, following he visited Germany, started drawing art about the Holocaust. His work has several themes common in deaf art, such as flames in the shape of hands or massive people without ears. In summary, there's a plenty of room for future research on this subject. This research may have future implication on other populations with disabilities. Testimonies are important tools in this research. However, they should be analyzed in light of the limitations. Another interesting field of research are the institution for deaf prior to the Holocaust. Lastly, I see this research as an important step in developing different educational programs for both hearing and deaf students. Thank you.